Good day and welcome to my channel. In today's video we look at the programming of drums. So I know a lot of time has passed since my previous upload, which was the first video in a series around writing and recording music. Since then I've released a couple of covers and I've vastly improved my workflow and how quickly I work, and I thought now would be as good a time as any to proceed with the series. So this video is going to be focused on an overview of the drum programming section, from selecting sample libraries to routing in DAWs and to actually writing the Midi parts, and some basic mixing moves that we can get started with. So because this is an incredibly vast topic to cover, it's not going to be a very deep dive into all of the topics. It's just going to be an overview to help with getting started. I would like to expand on this topic if there would be value for you guys. Just please let me know in the comments. But for now, let's go over to Studio One and we'll run through the drum programming overview. This is my session for my metal cover of Backstreet Boys' Everybody. We're going to, as I mentioned, be looking specifically at the drums component. So just to give you an overview of drum sample libraries, I personally use GetGood Drums Sample Libraries, and in this session I used the GetGood Drums P4 kit. I find with the GetGood Drums sample libraries there's a nice balance between quality and price, whereas other sample libraries will give you a very similar sort of quality of sound but at a far more premium price. Just some examples: we've got obviously the GetGood Drum sample libraries, we've got the Superior Drummer libraries, Easy Drummer, and there's many others. There's also some free options. Just one that I know of off the top of my head is MT Power Drum Kit. I haven't played around too much with that, so I can't give too much feedback on the quality of it or ease of use, but it could be worth looking into as a free option. Okay, so once you've decided upon a sample library that you're going to be using, you'll obviously have a little bit of initial setup in your DAW. So in the case of GetGood Drums libraries, they operate out of Kontakt. So there's quite a bit of initial setup with Kontakt, setting up the routing within your DAW. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it's a whole video topic on its own, but if you'd like some pointers on how I went about doing it in Studio One, please leave a comment below, and it's something that I could look at in a future video. Just to give you a perspective, so within Kontakt, we've got a number of outputs that you can create. I've created just the right number of mono and stereo outputs within Kontakt that I'd like. So for each of these outputs, I've assigned the various drum pieces. For example, kick goes to mono out 1, as well as the stereo out 16 and stereo 17. Then for snare, the snare top goes to mono 2, snare bottom to mono 3, and then again it goes out to the overheads in the room, and the same applies to toms and cymbals. Within Studio One, you see the various instrument outputs here. So I've got outputs, mono outputs 1 through 15. Then I've got a stereo output 16, 17, 18 and 19. So here I've got more outputs from Kontakt than I actually need for the P4 kit, but I find this comes in handy when I move to Modern and Massive, where I need a different number of mono and stereo outputs. So it's easier for me to swap between the sample libraries without having to redo the routing or having two templates with a different routing set up. Each output then has its own label for kick, snare, top, the various toms, cymbals, overheads in the room. So now that the routing is set up, if you click on any of the kit parts, you'll be able to see that channel engage on the mix window. For example, if we click the snare, see the snare top and snare bottom tracks are engaged, as well as the overhead and room stereo mics. So now that the routing in my DAW is sorted out, I then go to each channel and apply panning as I need to for the kit. So in drums, we want to have a nice spread across the stereo image, namely within Kontakt, we see a view of the kit. So we see from a drummer's perspective, sitting in front of the kit, that obviously the hi-hat is to their left, the floor toms go from the drummer's extreme right, across to the drummer's left, and then the kick and snare are directly centered in front of the drummer. So based on this drum kit layout, we would look at the panning of our kit. So here I've got rack tom 1 is panned to the left, rack tom 2 a little bit less to the left, floor tom 1 to the right, and floor tom 2 far to the right. And the same with the various cymbals, with the hi-hats, the rides, the china, the splash center, the mini hats, and the stack. So now that the routing is sorted, I'm going to just talk about some of my mixing related routing and how I run my sessions in Studio One. So each of the outputs or channels that I've discussed that come from Kontakt are routed to their respective buses. So we've got a kick bus where the kick mics come to, we've got a snare bus where the snare mics come to, then we've got buses for toms, cymbals, overheads, and rooms. On each bus I've applied some very basic mixing moves. So for example, I've got some EQ that's applied to the bus, and I've got some compression. This is basically where I have set up a mixing template where some of the major moves like around EQ and compression are made from the get-go. So then later in the songwriting or recording process, I've only got some minor tweaks or some slight tweaks for each part of the kit to suit the guitars, the vocals, etc. So in addition to these EQ and compression moves, I've got some sends out to a verb bus where I apply reverb to each of the buses, and then I've got a parallel compression send. So each of these buses gets sent to a parallel compression bus where I've applied a ton of compression where you see here. Now this adds a little bit of extra liveliness to the kit, and I can dial in just how much I want without having to apply such extreme amounts of compression to the drum sound as a whole. Same applies with the reverb, where I can dial in just the amount of reverb that I need rather than to the buses directly. So just to give you a perspective of this, let's solo the drum bus, and you see automatically the parallel compression bus and the verb buses are soloed as well. So we're just going to play through the main riff section of this song, and I'm going to disable the sends and re-enable them periodically just so that you can see how much of a difference parallel compression and reverb adds to the overall drum tone. So we'll start with it on. So you see it adds quite a lot of vibe to the sound of the drums. And the EQ and compression moves made specifically on the drum buses themselves, I'm just going to play through that main riff section again and enable and disable the compressors and the EQs so you can hear how much of a difference is being made there. Let's also just disable the sends so we can go between the raw kit and some of the processing that I'm doing. And when I disengage the inserts, you hear the kit revert to a more raw sort of sound. Okay, all of those drum buses that I've added the inserts to then are summed to an overall drum bus. This includes the parallel compression and the reverb bus, and this just adds a little bit, tiny little bit of compression just to help glue the sound of the kit together. This drum bus then is fed into an instrument bus through which the guitars and the bass guitars all come through just to help glue that all together. And from there we come to the main output where I add a tiny little bit of saturation and I have a limiter. So now that I've discussed selecting a drum sample library, routing it in your DAW, and making some of the initial major moves to get the vibe out of the kit initially, I'm going to start talking about the programming of the drums. So because I'm a guitar player, I tend to start off by recording a guitar part and then adding drums to it. So I'll start off with either a riff that I have pre-prepared, an idea that I'm noodle around with to get to where I like it, or I'll be doing a cover and I'll know what guitar parts I want to record. So I would start off by recording the guitar parts, for example here, and then apply drums to them. So we'll be looking specifically at the main riff part, which is this. Now I've muted the vocals in this video and I've muted the bass, just so we get an idea of where I start. Okay, so once I've recorded a guitar part and applied an amp sim tone to it that I like as a starting point, guitar, amp sims and recording of guitar I'll feature in a separate video, I would get going with writing the actual drum parts to go over it. So there's many ways you can go about recording drum MIDI. The first of which, we could use an E-kit, sort of like that one. Or if you have a MIDI controller like a keyboard, you can just play the drum parts on that, or you can use a mouse to click and program in the notes that you want. So generally my preferred approach is the point and click method, because that works best for me and it works quite quickly. Hello, just quickly stepping in to fill in some blanks. As you'll see in my Studio One session, I'm programming notes into a drum view. This is a Studio One view in particular. Not all DAWs might have it, but in the worst case, you'll be programming notes into a piano roll. And then one other thing that I didn't touch on is MIDI mapping. So the GetGood Drums Sample Libraries use their own MIDI maps, which differ slightly from general MIDI, which is what applications such as Guitar Pro use. If you're using GetGood Drums Sample Libraries, or your sample libraries also differ from general MIDI, you can either pull in general MIDI to your session and edit what notes the hits fall on, or you can update the MIDI mapping within the sample library. So you can do this in the GetGood Drums Sample Library, and in most other sample libraries, if you need to change their MIDI maps, you can do this as well. Cool. And back to the video. So how I would get started is by clicking in a kick pattern. So for example, we see this one for the main riff part of the Backstreet Boys cover. I've already clicked in the points. Let's just have a listen. So that's the initial rhythm that I've just set up. So then at this point is when I would program in the snare hits. So with the snare, I find this is where you really build in the vibe and the groove of the song, or the part of the song that you're programming drums for. For this main riff section, for the Backstreet Boys cover, I went with more of like a half-time feel, like this. So I've quite enjoyed that feel. Alternatively, what we could do is add a lot more snare hits, just as an example. You can hear that there's a little bit more sort of drive to the riff part. So once I've established the kick and snare rhythms, and therefore the groove for that section of the song, I would then put in the cymbals just to pull the whole groove together. So here we see I start each bar with a crash hit. Then I have two softer crash hits just to groove along with the drums, and a China hit, and that repeats. So at this point where you hear that the whole drum kit and the whole groove itself comes together quite nicely. So now that I've programmed a section of MIDI that I'm happy with, I can then copy it to any other parts in the song where that section would be applicable again. So for other parts of the song, various approaches that you can take are to have a slightly different feel. So from the main riff, where it's got sort of like a half-time feel, we go into the verse where it's a bit more of a like driven running riff, for example. Alternatively, you can take sections that you've programmed and do slight edits, do some variations. So it's quite important to ensure that you have a cohesive track and it doesn't feel like you've just pulled like 4 songs together. And in a curious case of lost footage, I appear to have lost my outro. I think that's as good a place as any to cap off this tutorial. As I said, it's not a super wide deep dive into the topic as there's just so much to discuss. But again, just leave comments below on any questions that you have and I can address those in a future video. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something cool. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.